Hi, Francis.
How you doing?
Hi.
Good to see you.
You too. I think for the benefit of the people watching this, just want to spend a few minutes just introducing yourself, talking about your background, and I'll do the same.
Yeah, sure. So, Francis Donohue. I am 18 months approximately working for ABP, which is the consultancy we're in now. Consulting is a very new area for me. Prior to the last 18 months where I've been working with ABP, I spent 4 years working for and with UiPath, the automation organisation out of Romania, where I was partnering with and directly supporting customers of theirs to either establish and or grow their automation programs. But for most of my career, I worked for a global bank in part of their technology organisation, where we were focused on essentially solving big business problems. I look back on it now, and it was business transformation, but it was entirely led by identifying business problems and seeing how we could solve them, and usually with a technology slant, because that was the angle we were coming from. And they were in key areas like global business processes like incident management, change management, problem management, password management, onboarding employees, offboarding employees, all the types of things that organisations take for granted are just a pain, they're cumbersome, they're difficult. But we kind of took it the perspective they don't have to be that way. They don't have to be that way. And if there are some smaller, even incremental or big changes that you can make to some of those processes, it can be transformational for your business stakeholders. And that's what we did. I had a lot of great and very exciting projects that I worked on, including one particular system around approvals management, where I started from scratch with nothing but a 2-page PowerPoint, where I was just evangelizing about having a system that would do this, to the degree that one day one of the business leaders asked me to demonstrate the system to him. It didn't even exist. All it was an idea. But that allowed us to be able to create a prototype and allowed us to move it forward into saying, let's do this for a tiny part of the business and see if there was value. And that then ultimately became a global system. So I've led all through those years of focusing on a business problem, understanding what would be the benefit in solving it, and then head down, see what we can do to achieve some or all of that goal.
Yeah. And I think in working with you, I think that those experiences, having been in the customer's position, having figured out how to do this, delivered it, measured the value, it brings a level of credibility that a lot of people in our position just don't have, because they've done it for other customers, but they've never done it for themselves.
And I think you're absolutely correct. And I think it's probably the greatest strength that I have personally, is that my default position all the time is to think like the customer, because I simply think about what was it like for me in that situation, trying to deliver something, either working with certain different technologies or different partners or different capabilities, external and internal. What was it like for me as a customer, and how was I thinking about it? And therefore, now working either with UiPath or ABP or as an external service provider, how should we be thinking about it, and how should we help to understand how the customer's thinking? Yeah. Absolutely.
So what you talked about there, about your experience when you started out using modern technology to deliver transformation, do you ever see situations where companies approach it differently? So you focused on an outcome. This is what we need to achieve. This current state, future state, how do we get there? It was all about that outcome. Do you ever see other situations where other organisations approach it slightly differently?
Well, I guess what I see a lot of, and I think it makes the journey a lot more difficult, is, and I use this example all the time, if you focus on we have to get an outcome, but we're going to use this tool to do it, then invariably you're restricting your mindset, you're restricting your thinking, you're restricting the potential of where your outcome can be, because you're just entirely focused on the tool. And I use the analogy of, if you have some jobs you need done in your house and you bring a carpenter over, you wouldn't ask the carpenter to show you his screwdriver and his spanner and his saw. You don't care about any of that stuff. You care about the door that needs to be hung or the shelf that needs to be put up, and whatever the tool is that's the right tool to fix that is the tool that will be used to do that. But unfortunately, and we see this a lot, I see this a lot, where we have a customer or a stakeholder or a business leader or a tech leader who looks at the tool first, I just from my own experience, I feel like they're just restricting the potential, they're restricting the opportunity, and they're potentially slowing down their journey to success. That, you know, and unfortunately, it's very common though.
Yeah, and it is interesting. So when we look at tools in the modern workplace, it's interesting because if I was, for example, going to put up a shelf or a wardrobe, I probably wouldn't do it with a manual screwdriver or a manual Allen key. I'd probably find some way to use mechanized tools to make my life easier, enable me to do that job faster, which means I can either do more jobs or I can have more time for myself.
Yeah.
And do you think that translates into the workplace as well?
Completely. But I would suggest that as much as that is based on absolutely using an electric drill instead of a manual tools, there's a mindset change that's required. There's a mindset change to be able to say, if we look at this differently, and if we use some sort of automation or better or more improved tool sets or capabilities, what's the impact of that? What's the impact of that actual change?
Yeah.
And what can we do with that positive impact, which is getting more time back, being able to do more work, being able to do more with the same, being more cost effective, being able to build in more governance and controls, because a certain amount of that will be built into the tool set, being more efficient. There's lots and lots of other tangential benefits that can come from that, but there's a certain set of mindset changes that have to happen in order for that to happen. So if that makes sense.
It does. So are there some techniques that you've started to apply when let's imagine we've got a customer that's never embarked on any form of modern day digital transformation. They've probably done little bits here and there, maybe implementing systems, but never probably thinking about things holistically in the organisation. I would imagine there's an element of, well, I've done this job the same way for 20 years. That's the way I was trained. That's the way I train other people that come in, and why change? Do you see that kind of resistance, that kind of mindset?
Yeah, and you've heard me use this phrase a lot, and I'll tell you what that phrase is. But what I get a great kick out of is when I hear a customer or a stakeholder use the very same phrase with their teams, and it is imagine if. So we don't, when we're in that situation, and you know we've worked together, as you know, a lot with a lot of customers who are either their journey has stagnated to some degree, or at the early stage, or they're having some issues with the trajectory or how fast they're moving. I believe you completely step back from it, completely step back. And we had that conversation where we get the customer or the business stakeholder or whoever it is to finish that sentence. Imagine if we could what?
Yeah.
And again, it's not about saying how we do it or when we do it or the cost or the effort or the timeline. It's just, what would transformation be like, and what would be the impact of that transformation on the business?
Yeah.
That's the starting point. And that's also a reset point. So we've seen it with several customers where, you know, as I say, the journey might not be moving as efficiently as they would have thought, or they're not really getting the value that they expected from the capability or the technology or the tools, and they're looking for some help. And it's I don't think I've ever seen an example where the solution is just reduce the cost of your licenses, or make your team smaller, yes, or stop doing some of the work. That's never the answer. The answer is, let's reset and focus on ensuring that we're looking at the right target, that everybody's aligned towards that target, and that we have defined some sort of a plan to achieve that. Yeah. Because if we reset, we will find that the target is slightly different to the journey or the point that we're looking at. So that's the way I approach it, and you've heard me say that in conversations with customers. And then, as I said, it's fantastic when I hear one of those leaders within the business just talking to their teams, and they go, now we want you to imagine if you could do X, Y, and Z, and then that stimulates that whole thought process within the teams. Yeah,
when I see that happen, I often think they've unlocked the inner Francis.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment. I'll take that as a compliment. Yeah.
So thinking about, you talked about sitting down with customers and having that imagine if conversation. How do you get to that point? How do you get people in the room to start to engage with something like this?
It has to be, you have to put yourself in the customer's position. You have to put yourself in the shoes of the customer. You have to be very clear on understanding what is in it. You have to put yourself in their mind, and they're asking the question, what's in this for me? You have to be able to answer that question. Because everybody's busy, everybody's under pressure, everybody has budgets and resourcing and time and all sorts of other constraints, and everybody's busy. So to ask somebody to take time out of their day or their week, and the way we've done it with some customers is we actually do workshops where they're taking several hours out and taking whole teams out. Why would they do that? Why would they do that? We have to be able to answer that question. But when we get the answer to that question and we have that conversation with the customer, it's a very easy conversation. Because we're not saying, if you did this, you would, well, I guess we do arrive at that point, but again, the second half of that sentence is something that they articulate, not us. Yeah. If you were to do this, we could do X, we could do Y, we could stop doing this, we could do more of that. And that's the starting point. And if we can get to that point, then it's a much smoother journey in terms of discussion, engagement, teasing out the problems and the thoughts, and coming up with some ideas. If you don't do that, you have busy people whose work lives you've disrupted, who are wondering why they're here, listening to an external consultant talk about technology they don't know anything about, which they don't care about because they're too busy and we're already disrupting their day, and they go back to their day job afterwards. So I think that's the secret, is put yourself in the customer's shoes.
So why not just use tools? I mean, there are tools out there that will discover these things that you may have heard of, things like process and task mining, that will essentially take the person out of the loop and find these things for them. Why not use tools like that instead?
You can do that. You can do that. I think it's a colourful picture, and tools like that are just one colour in the picture. So in isolation, if you have a picture and you strip out all the colour except one, it's not a meaningful picture. But putting that in there as a way of identifying opportunities for improvement it's a great enabler to do that. But I just wouldn't do it in isolation. And yeah, I've done that. In fact, the first time I had an experience of that was probably 8 years ago in my previous life, where we wanted to use tools to do discovery. Again, there's a challenge around what the perception is. What are you trying to discover? What's the purpose of the tool set? What are you going to do with the data when you get it? How much of it is anonymized versus how much of my personal information are you capturing? And then what happens next? So there's a journey in terms of stakeholder management and engagement, and communication is absolutely key. But I will also say I have never seen an example where, when that's done properly and we deploy tools, that it doesn't exceed expectations. Mm-hmm. It always does. We always get these, what I call nuggets of gold. And even if you only get one or two insights that say to you, we didn't know that, we weren't aware of this. And it doesn't mean that you have to automate. It doesn't mean you have to deploy a solution. The sweetest ones are the ones where you can say, we just need to stop doing this because we don't need to do it anymore. Yeah. And that can be a business transformation just by stopping doing things. So those sorts of insights, you tend not to get those insights from manual discovery activities and workshops. You tend to get them from automated tool sets. I'm a big fan, but I think it's always a mix of the two.
And it's interesting, the point you just mentioned, just stop doing something. I saw a situation last year with an organisation that I was working with. They'd had a failed automation program from a few years ago because they'd taken a tool-centric approach, as you talked about. And we worked with them to say, okay, well, let's look at how we can support you to identify the right areas of the business. And we use a tool to capture the ideas. And we were talking through one of the payroll processes to do with maternity entitlement calculations. And they said to me, they took me through the process and said, okay, well, we calculated in the system, but we calculate it manually. And I said, why do you do it manually? He said, well, when we started doing this 10 years ago, the system was always wrong. I said, how often is the system wrong now? Oh, never. Nice. So this was an opportunity just to stop doing something manually, because they'd done it that way for 10 years and stop questioning it.
Yeah.
I see the similar thing with things like reports.
Yeah. Reports is a classic area.
It is.
Yeah.
So I was in a workshop. We actually had, it was with finance, and we had the chief information officer, the CIO in the workshop. And she said, oh yeah, I get that report from you. I don't use it because it doesn't give me the information that I need.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing there is situations where people are doing stuff, they're actually wasting time.
That's right.
Because they're not being effective. They're not doing the right thing
Yeah.
in the right way. So thinking about that, how can we help our customers to better understand how to identify these things? You talked about the workshops, you talked about a little bit about education. How can we help them to be able to do this themselves? Are there other things, tools, training, awareness we can provide?
And I suppose the first thought that comes into my head is education and awareness to a degree. That people can feel that it's okay to question, is this something we should be doing? Is there something different we could do that would make this more efficient? Is there something that we should stop doing? I think that education and awareness is really important, and that's part of what we spend a lot of our time doing.
Yes.
Because it's only through having those conversations around the potential for change that people tend to realise what the opportunity for change is. Because exactly like you say, the reports get generated, and somebody works very hard to do those reports. And you know, it's an important job that they're doing. But if you look at it end to end, the value out of the work that's being done here is not being realised on the other side. I had an example of like that a few years ago with a customer where they were doing a changeover of an incident management system, and we were supporting part of their automation work. And one of the big challenges that I saw that they would have is they were generating huge reports, monthly reports for all their stakeholders, all sorts of different types of reports. And my immediate thought was, it's going to take us forever to reproduce all these reports. And I really, like you, I questioned, are these actually being used? I did some little bit of random sampling, and in the small sampling I did, I found that they weren't to the degree that it was assumed. So what we did was we created a core set of reports with the new system, which was a fraction of the size of the other ones. And we said to all the stakeholders, we will give you any report you want outside of the core set. All you need to do is ask for it.
Yeah.
And it transformed reporting within that business. Because the reality was 70% of it probably was never used and not needed. And we were able to strip away 70% of the reporting simply by asking the question, not assuming that the way it always was the way it would always be. So I think that education and awareness, and I would say, you know, we're very like-minded on this because we spend a lot of time with customers talking about this. I think that's the first step. And that's how you open up the opportunity, that's how you open up the conversations.
So the customer starts to capture these ideas and share them, and you know, we get insight and visibility to them. How do they then start to identify which are the right ones to take forward? What do they need to think about?
And again, it's if you put yourself, and this I think about this all the time, and it's just purely from my own experience. But you put yourself in the customer's shoes. I talk about value, and I have often said value in this context is so important. I say it's so important it'll be written on my headstone. I'm actually thinking, you know, maybe we should put it on my headstone. Value, but let that be a long way away. But what I mean is, you have to understand what's the value. So you have a list of 20 ideas. What's the value of, what's the problem, and what would be the value in solving it? And what's absolutely key there is, what's the problem as the customer describes it, not as we assume it? And even more important, what's the measuring stick or the measuring tape that the customer uses to measure value, and how does this idea stack up? And by doing both of those, by being very clear on what the problem is, and spending time on understanding what the value is of resolving this problem, you have a prioritised business case for change. If you don't have those, you just have stuff. You have a list of things that we could do, systems we could upgrade, changes that we can make, cost that we can incur, disruption within the organisation. That's the way it's perceived, and that tends to be what happens. But you can do all those things. You can have that disruption, you can incur that cost, but you should always, always, always have line of sight of the value to be derived from it and measure along the way. That's where the automation programs and the transformations that I've seen are successful, where they're very clear on that. And the ones that are not so clear on that are the ones that tend to struggle.
Sometimes I see situations where the customer says, yeah, but we don't measure ourselves, we don't have any key performance indicators or KPIs around that particular area. So I've heard you say things, well, what strategic pillars, what corporate objectives can you start to align this to? Do you want to talk a little bit more about how an organisation can start to think that way?
Yeah, and I did this with a customer probably 3 or 4 years ago, where it was a very big organisation, and another separate part of the business wanted to start on their automation journey, and were a little bit behind the curve compared to the broader organisation, but they were a separate business in themselves. And they said, we've now got these capabilities, we have these tools, we have enterprise tools, we have access to developers and everything, we just don't know what to do. We have literally nothing to do. So the conversation we had was around, well, who are the business leaders within this business? What are the organisation goals? What's the strategy for the organisation for this year? And what are the challenges that those business leaders will have to achieve those goals? And very quickly, a number of KPIs bubbled up, a number of challenges within the organisation we identified by just having these conversations. We also looked at the organisation's annual report. We looked at it together to identify what are the conversations that this little, very small transformation team and the leader of that team, what are the conversations you could have with those very busy business leaders to open the door to some transformation? And the conversation led by the kind of topics we just said, focused on the organisation's strategic goals for the year and recognising that within the different business they had business aligned and functional aligned goals. The conversation was we have capabilities that can help you to ensure that you achieve those goals or mitigate the risk of you not achieving them. And what are the problems that you think will occur to stop you from achieving them? Or what are the challenges that you're having 2 months, 3 months, 4 months into the year that makes it more likely you're at risk of not achieving your goals? And then by, again, identifying those problems, those risks, those issues, we translated it into opportunities.
Yeah.
Can't change the world, can't solve the world, but out of that we were able to identify areas where we said, if we could do this, it would help you here. If we could do that, it would help you here. That was about 2 years ago. That programme is roaring ahead.
Yeah.
It is massively successful because that's the approach they've stuck with. They've simply stuck with the business aligned strategy, goals, problems, challenges, and how do we support them to achieve all of that.
Nice.
And build it into a value-based pipeline.
Nice.
And I'd love to see that happen in every organisation, because I think that's I've always said pipeline is the lifeblood of any transformation. Pipeline is just a list of value-based opportunities. If you don't have that, you have nothing. You have no transformation program. But if you have a pipeline of stuff to do and it's value-based, aligned with the organisation or functional corporate goals, you're on a winner.
So that's interesting. So having that pipeline of business transformation, business improvement opportunities that are identified and accepted by the people that do the work today, because that's where we need to win hearts and minds. So we understand what benefits we expect to get. Can you talk a little bit about how we measure those benefits at the other end? So we go live with something, we've implemented something. What should we be looking for? Should we be looking at how many things we've done, or should we be looking at something else?
Well, I've always said, and I say this to every customer I talk to now, you should never put something into, it's not considered in production until it appears on a dashboard in some shape or form. And never consider it to be complete until it appears on a dashboard. And why do I say that? Because you have to be able to measure, the value of the work being done. And for sure, sometimes it is literally the number of transactions that your automation or your digital assistant might have completed. But more often than not, there's a value associated with each transaction, and we should also have that represented in the dashboard. The easier ones to capture, the easier ones to track and report are KPIs like that. Every time this transaction is done, it gives 7 minutes back to the team, and that 7 minutes has a value to our team of highly qualified people of X amount of pounds and pence. So they're very clear reports that you can create. Other ones are a little bit more challenging. The impact on your customer experience, the impact on the employee experience, but they're just as important. So some of them might be statistics that you would report on a daily basis, some weekly, some monthly, some quarterly, and different ways of capturing it. Yeah. But the secret, though, is to make sure that you capture them and report on them. I've gone to the extreme where I've even put quotes from business leaders on a dashboard, because I've no other way of measuring the impact, only this is what they're telling me is the impact. Yeah. But that's still important, because that helps drive the hearts and minds around more transformation, and also anyone that might be watching from the sidelines who's not sure if this is something that they're comfortable with. Well, look what they're saying about the benefit that they're getting. And you out of that, you sometimes can create a level of, I guess, what I would call professional envy. Yeah. Why are you doing that for them? And I want some of that. Yeah. You say, of course, you can have some of that too. I want to see your name on the dashboard saying this is phenomenal, and what you're getting is the same. Yeah. So it's a mix of all of that. When I go into a customer site, I'm looking for things like digital dashboards. I'm looking for things like newsletters. And I ask that question. And especially if I see a digital dashboard or a notice board or television screens in the canteen, I'm immediately talking to the transformation team saying, when's the last time you had something up there to talk about what you've done for somebody? Or even a quote from somebody to say, look what the transformation team did for me. Yeah. So, when you talk about reporting, it's more than just reporting. It's almost evangelizing about transformation, about automation, about where we were and where we're going and how we're getting on along the way, and bringing the hearts and minds with you.
It's interesting, because I think this is why we work well together, because you go in there and you're looking for one thing, I'm going there looking for something subtly different. So when I go into an organisation, for example, if I see 2 monitors on the desk, I know there's an opportunity for business improvement, because people are having to have 2 pieces of information side by side,
absolutely right.
Probably to copy and paste between them in all likelihood. So it's interesting how between us we're covering all bases.
And I think you're making you're hitting on a good point there, though, because I think that we do look on things. You and I, we look on things. I use the phrase, we're looking through a particular lens. We do look on things through slightly different lenses, and I do think it's very complementary. Because I will, to be honest, to this day, I still go in and I talk to business leaders and stakeholders about business problems, and especially in the early part of the conversation, I really have no idea how we're going to solve this. But I'm entirely focused on the imagine if statement. Yes. And where I think you and I work together very well is you're already formulating, well, hold on, 3 steps down the road, and imagine if could be this. Yeah. And when you start drawing a picture or forming what potentially this might look like as we bring people down the journey. So I think it works very well. It's very complementary. Yeah.
I just want to roll back a little bit, because you started to talk about something earlier that I think is very interesting. You started to touch upon the coordination between the transformation team and other elements of the business. Is there a need for things like a centre of excellence and an operating model around some of these things? And can you talk a little bit about how that could evolve?
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around what a centre of excellence is, and there isn't enough understanding around what a good operating model is. And most people I would talk to probably wouldn't know the difference. So this again comes back to education and awareness. In the early days of a transformation program, I tried to not spend too much time talking about what your in-state centre of excellence might look like, because it frightens people away. It's daunting. What I'm more interested in is your operating model and how you're going to execute automation within the business, especially in more recent years where you're using RPA and capabilities like that. Because years and years ago, if you wanted to do some transformation, everything took 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. The design, the development, the discovery, design, development, the testing, the deployment, every part of that would take months and was huge cost. But one thing I did learn through that part of my professional career was there's governance, controls, best practices. There are guidelines, guide rails that you must follow to make sure you're doing the right thing. And the risk I see with RPA and tools like it is, because you can do a lot of this quicker, is that you cut corners. Yeah. The secret to that is having an effective automation operating model. But that's not something that falls out of the sky. There's an education around that. What are the governance and controls and documentation and sign-offs? One of my colleagues when I was in UiPath just made a comment one day we were having coffee, and it really stuck with me, because we were having a challenge like this with a customer who was delivering a lot of automation to production very fast and was having a lot of failures and a poor experience for the automation team and for the business stakeholders, and he couldn't understand why. And myself and this chap were having coffee, and he said, just because it's automation and we can do things quickly, it doesn't mean that we forget all of the lessons we've learned about development best practices. And I say that to customers now. We still have to follow best practices. So you still have to apply the controls, the governance, the best practice, the risk reduction, the documentation, the sign-offs. And yeah, that elongates the process, but it's about doing things properly, safely, securely every time. That comes back to what you were saying then, that's the automation operating model. The Centre of Excellence is only one part of an automation operating model, and there's a maturity that you start from. So of course, if you're starting from scratch, you're not going to put in a team of 20 people. You're going to say that if you're starting from scratch, you're going to focus on here's one problem that we could solve and what would be the benefit. Come back to what we said earlier. But then if we want to scale that out, what would it look like? And it's a combination of resources internally and working with a partner. So you get the skills from a partner to help you to deliver at pace, to continue to deliver transformation, to continue to deliver value for the business, to continue to change the hearts and minds. And over time, if you choose to do that, you start to build your centre of excellence where you build the capabilities in there. And that would be the development, the business analysis, the testing, the support, the COE leadership and evangelization, and all of that goes with that. Yes. So I don't know, would you agree?
I agree. I think that it's important to understand that these things evolve and mature over time, and probably become more formal and more strict as the program matures. Because suddenly, I think I've experienced this, where suddenly knowledge starts to leave the business. Because if you've put things like business process orchestration, business process management, automation, artificial intelligence into the business, people aren't doing those things anymore. And it's not necessarily forget, but it's an element of, I'm going to need a bit longer to do that. Now I have to do it manually if something goes wrong. So that maturing of the automation operating model, or whatever operating model it is, becomes even more critical, because you need to make sure you've got the right fallback positions in place. Now, there's no guarantees in anything, so you need to make sure that there's a way to be able to recover from a situation that you weren't anticipating. And I think the operating model will give you the guardrails and the guidelines to be able to do that.
And that takes time. And I've come across situations where you have to be agile with a small a. You have to be agile at the beginning. You have to get stuff done, get stuff out the door, prove that that transformation is something that works within a business, especially if you have some detractors or you have people within the business who are saying, why would we change? We know what we're doing. We've always done it this way. So you have to be efficient, effective in quickly demonstrating value. At the same time, without losing sight of what you just said, that you need to, long term, you have to have those guardrails in place, because if you put an automation or anything into production, and then that knowledge leaves the organisation, where's the documentation? Yeah. What happens when a system changes? What happens when the process changes? What happens if there's an outage or a failure? That's where all your guardrails come in. Yeah. And that's all part of the education and awareness process, I would say, with customers. Right. So Dean, we've talked a lot about the start of the journey, and that's, I guess, where I've had most of my experience, and I think where I bring most of the table around helping a business or business leaders to identify what the opportunity might be, or the pain point that should be prioritised or focused on. What do you do next, though? And this is where you really have, and where I think we work very well together. How do you approach the next stage of it, where you do have to start to draw some sort of a picture of what the solution might be and the tools or capabilities that would be part of that? How do you approach that?
Yeah, so when I'm in customer workshops, I'm listening to the problems they've got, the systems they're using, the tools that they have access to. And in my mind, I'm starting to think about how would we deliver this? I don't want to get into solutioning too early, because I still want to continue to listen. But at some point, we need to start working back to how we're going to deliver this outcome. And a lot of it comes down to understanding what the customer need is. So in many cases, a lot of the engagements we have, automation or intelligent automation is an obvious candidate. So what is the right tool in the market? Now, ABP, we're a partner, platinum partner of UiPath. We've both worked at UiPath. We know the platform very well. But it's not always going to be the answer to UiPath now, what's the question? So some of it comes down to what is the organisation trying to do? So in many cases, a lot of quick wins will be to automate something. Now, because of our experience of working with UiPath, quite often we'll look at intelligent automation as a tool or a platform to be able to deliver that. But one of the things I often see is that it's not just about automation in isolation. We were working together in a workshop. I don't know if you remember it. We were working with an organisation that's in the travel and transport industry, and they were talking about the sickness and absence process. And we found out that across 3 different sites, that process starts off in 3 different ways. As it gets further down the process, it starts to converge. Well, in that situation, I was thinking, well, yes, automation has a role to play because we need to get data between systems that don't talk to each other today. But also there was a need for process orchestration to get consistency in how that process runs. So in my mind, I'm thinking, well, we need business process management. We need intelligent automation. We may even need document processing. We may need some kind of rules management. So in my mind, I'm starting to think about how do we start to deliver this now in a way that doesn't just solve this problem here, which is getting data between these systems. I'm thinking about how do we streamline and make the end-to-end process more efficient, but also more standards-based as well. So now somebody new comes into the organisation, if they essentially follow a governed and managed absence process. They're not having to call their mate and say, sorry, who do I ring? Oh, it depends what shift you're on as to who you ring.
That's right.
We want to take all that judgment and guesswork out of it and get something consistent in there. So my approach is often, it's not just about one technology, it's about understanding the end-to-end problem, where can we help? And then quite often what we will do is we'll say, okay, well, let's fix this bit here.
Yeah.
We can do the bigger piece, but if we deliver value here, first of all, we free people up to do more interesting work. We also make the process take some friction out of it, make it more seamless, make it run more efficiently. That then gives us the headspace, or more importantly, the customer the headspace and the capacity to start thinking about how do we look at this now holistically. So I think for me that's an important factor is how can we get those quick wins and how can we help the customer with a longer term transformation and improvement.
And is business process redesign always a requirement in these situations? Or is it like you said there where you can focus on a part in the middle where you can deliver some quick wins and some value with a view to some long-term redesign or long-term discussion? Where does the redesign fit, especially in an example like you've described, where we can see the starting points are different depending on the geographical location, which in itself doesn't sound like it makes sense, but that's the reality.
Yeah, so in this case what we will probably do is we'll probably go a little bit downstream at that start of that process and start to look at where's the data flowing between the systems. And quite often I use the phrase that today people are the glue between systems because they just don't talk to each other. Well, if we now have a digital workforce, we can make that glue digital. It gives us the more agility to be able to deliver change, start to think about new things we weren't able to do before because we now got the capacity and the tools to be able to do those things. So fix something here. Further upstream, where we've got some divergence in the execution of the process, then we'll start to do some process re-engineering. What is the right path for people to take? Don't just take it from one side because that's the way they do it. We've got to make sure what is right for the business, what is right for the people. And this gets us more towards user journeys. So don't think about, okay, well, I've got my process where I call in sick and I've got to figure out who I call, depending on my shift. And then that has a series of steps that will go through different people. Start to think about it is what can we do here? How can we fix this, get it more efficient, get it as standards based? Once we've done that, then we can start to think about how we're going to then make that more efficient. So we've now got a standard process. We've done our process re-engineering. We may have done some data quality improvements, maybe some training. Now can we put systems over the top of that that are going to make it even more efficient, even more effective, and take bottlenecks out, take judgment out, on some of these simple processes and have those consistency of rules execution, for example. So I think for me, it's that aspect of finding the right places to start, getting those quick wins, because what they do as well is, if we've had a workshop with a customer and they've identified some ideas, if we then take 12 months before we do anything,
exactly.
they disengage.
That's right, yeah.
But if we can start to deliver some quick wins, people have bragging rights.
Yeah.
That thing that is now working a lot better, that was my idea. I submitted that in the workshop.
Yeah.
And these are the benefits that are getting off the back of it. So suddenly, we're creating champions and evangelists within the organisation.
And they are so important in any sort of business transformation. It's not the technology that will sell itself, it's the evangelists and the champions that sell the transformation, and the technology just goes along for the journey.
Yeah. And it's interesting, when I look at the workshops that I've done over the years, the most successful ones are where we've had the right stakeholder engagement, delivering the right messages to why are we doing this in our organisation, why is it important to us, and why do we want you to engage with it. The workshop that always sticks in my mind, that failed in my mind, is where that didn't happen. Yes, they asked people to attend the workshop. Yes, we got some ideas. From memory, we got 5 after 2 weeks. Bear in mind, most of all the workshops we do today, we're identifying 40 plus ideas within that same 2-week period.
The most recent workshop we did 4 weeks ago, we have over 100 ideas.
Wow.
And the first 6 ideas have 10,000 hours of benefit. And that's not my data or your data, that's the customer out of that workshop saying just 6 out of over 100 would give us 10,000 hours back. So the conversation in that situation now is a completely different conversation. It's not about, and it's not about what even, we're still not talking about the tools, which is kind of where I was leading to, what would we do next and how do we form a solution. We're not even at that stage yet. But any question of whether a business transformation is the right thing to do is completely gone out the window. It's how quickly can we transform now that we can see the potential that we would deliver from doing this. So you're absolutely correct, but it does need the right level of stakeholder support and engagement, and it does need that follow through and that commitment from the business. You don't have to boil the ocean, you don't have to commit to doing 100 things, but in this particular example, if you do the first 6, you've transformed the business. Yeah. And you have the hearts and minds won for continued change for forever.
And in that situation, do you think the customer should then just carry on, stop building pipeline and just say, we've got 100 ideas, that's a lot. Should they stop and start to just do these initial 6 and then do the other 94?
Absolutely not. In fact, because the pipeline, I always think of it as almost a living, breathing entity within your transformation program. And the reason I say that is there's no such thing as a bad idea, but the very next person that puts their hand up and said, imagine if we could do this, or here's a business problem I'd love to solve, that could be the one that goes right up to the top of the queue. So we should never, ever, ever rest on our laurels to say we know everything we need to do and the priority of the list, and we're just going to execute for the next 2 years. I'm constantly telling customers and business stakeholders, be on the lookout for those opportunities for change and capture them within the tool or whatever way you're doing it. As an aside, we know that UiPath has a tool called Automation Hub, and it's my favourite part of the entire tool suite.
Mine too.
Because it is the mechanism, and it's my opinion, by far the single best mechanism for capturing the business transformation opportunity in any business. Without that, how do you do it? And I remember years ago talking to somebody who was on this journey, and they were saying the biggest challenge they had was around their pipeline. And I said, because people don't know how to engage me. Do they send me an email? Do they write me a letter? How do they actually get something onto my queue? Do I even have a queue? That Automation Hub solves that problem. But it has to be a living, breathing part of your automation program. I'm sure you would agree.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that I agree with you. It's my favourite product as well. Because it's essentially the kick-starting of a transformation program. And it was an interesting thing you mentioned there. So you talked about Automation Hub, the product name, but then you quickly talked about a repository of improvement ideas.
Yeah.
So are you saying that Automation Hub is not just for automation ideas?
I have actually petitioned in a small way. My voice has not been heard yet, but I've petitioned in a small way that it actually should be called Transformation Hub, not Automation Hub. Because putting a header Automation Hub on it assumes everything going in there will be automated. Absolutely not. It's any idea for transformation. It could be the simplest idea in the world. I talked to a customer 3 months ago, and they were talking about how they write stuff down on sheets of paper. And I said, what if you had whiteboards on the wall and people could just put stuff there for the particular thing that they were doing? They said, that's a great idea. Put that in your transformation hub. Yeah. Put that in your automation hub. It's not about automation, but it's helping to transform a tiny part of how they operate it, but it would be a business improvement. Yeah. So that's the thing about Automation Hub. It really is. It's a repository for transformation opportunity. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, because there was a customer I was working with earlier this year where they have a transformation program, and in this case, automation is just part of that. So they've already identified what they're going to deliver as part of their transformation program. And what they've done is they've looked at the ideas in Automation Hub and said, okay, this is in scope of the transformation program. It's going to get delivered anyway. This is out of scope, therefore we can look at other ways in which we can deliver this, one of which may be automation. And so it's a great way for them to be able to then start to demonstrate how they're delivering against the demand from the business with their transformation program. And not just saying, so suddenly transformation is something that happens to them, it's something that they are part of.
And the mistake that I've seen made, which can cause transformation or an automation program to slow down, is where if you were to ask objectively, well, tell me about your program, and they say we have, let's say, 3 digital assistants and we have X and Y and Z. No business leader cares about any of that stuff. Yeah. They really don't. What they care about is we've done X amount of automation ideas through to production, and this is the benefit you're getting, and this is what we're getting every week and every month, and ideally you want to be able to show that on a report that's instantly available. And I encourage business leaders to have them up, as I said earlier, on their digital dashboards. The very next question you get asked in that situation is, that's fantastic, everything you've delivered to date, what are you delivering next? Yeah. And that's your pipeline. Yeah. And if you can answer those 2 questions very clearly, the piece in the middle around how it's delivered, albeit with the governance controls, best practices, and everything that goes with that, that will just happen. That will happen. And the program will be successful. But you have to be able to answer both of those. Crystal clear on the value we've derived to date for the investment that we've made, and crystal clear on what we're doing in the next quarter, the next 6 months, the next year, and the value that will derive. If you have both of those answers, the program will be successful, and then keep feeding the pipeline.
And it's interesting that you talk about that longer term vision, that 6 to 12 months, because for me that's critical, because your business case is probably going to be based on budget windows,
that's right,
financial years. So having that vision out at least that far, if not further, is critical.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is you talked earlier about essentially pivoting throughout that period
at any time
as to where a new golden nugget comes along, we pivot to that.
Yeah. What about a situation then where, the fact is organisations want to be innovative. Organisations to compete need to be innovative. They need to be seen to be using the latest technologies in chatbots, in conversational AI, in chat GPT enabled type of capabilities. Yeah. How do you approach that conversation, or when you're asked about how are we going to deploy a chatbot in our business, what's the answer to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the most difficult questions I was asked recently is, where can we use AI in our business? Artificial intelligence. And I said, okay, what problems do you have? Well, no, we've seen this technology and we think we'd like to see where we can use it. For me, it always comes back to, where are the business problems? What are your challenges? So I'll give you an example. So a couple of years ago, I was working with an insurance company, and I had the fortunate opportunity to sit with their renewals team. And I was listening on calls, and it was fascinating because it was interesting for me as a neutral observer to listen to the type of things that were coming in on a regular basis. So a customer will call in and say, my car insurance premium at renewal is too high. Can you reduce it? No, it's £50 more than it was last year. And the first thing they would do is say, okay, well, let me see what I can do. They put them on hold. And then they would do some calculations. They would say, okay, well, if I take your partner off, it will reduce your premium to this, option A. Then say, okay, let me try something else. So put them on hold for a few minutes, and then they say, okay, well, come back, and they say, well, if we reduce your mileage to this, here's option B. Let me try something else. And they say, okay, well, if we had your house insurance to the policy, here's option C. 5 or 10 minutes kind of elapsed between getting the first figure and the last figure. The customer probably didn't write them down. So now we're asking them to remember these things. So I went away and I started to think about this. I didn't go into this thinking, okay, automation is going to be the answer. The answer was that I came up with was part automation and part of a new user interface, something we kind of coined as an app. So when a customer calls in, they can trigger this app. It will capture some of the customer information, and in the background, would have multiple digital workers going away, finding all these different permutations, and then presenting them in the user interface to the call agent. Well, first of all, it reduces the call handling time, but more importantly,
It's huge.
now the customer has those options back to back. Here's the options you can have for you. So it's a way for it to be able to transform the engagement and the customer journey around renewals when somebody calls into the contact centre, so that suddenly they get a more informed set of options that they can then make a decision against because they're hearing them back to back. Now, I didn't go into that thinking, okay, I've got a chatbot, I've got an automation, I've got AI. It was going, what is the problem in front of me, and how can we solve that? So for me, I'll often see opportunities, because you talked about chatbots. Quite often, I'll see things in areas like HR and finance and customer service, where you see things like emails coming in, and people say, it'd be great if I could automatically reply to those emails.
Imagine if.
Yeah, so yes. But then when we start to understand the nature of the problem, and I start to probe a little bit more, talk about some of the types of inquiries you get. Yeah, most of them are just very easy to respond to. For example, I'm working with a government department around recruiting, and a lot of the inquiries they get are, what's the status of my application? What's the status of my background checks? That's just data.
Yeah, it's just data. Yeah.
So what they do today is that sits in a queue for a team to work through. Well, imagine if we could respond to that. Imagine if, rather than waiting for people to message us and saying, what's the status, we can automatically on a regular basis say, this is the current state of your application. So suddenly we're not reacting to things, we're being proactive.
Yeah.
What if it was a bit more of an involved type inquiry, change of address? Why can't we do that through a self-service capability with conversational AI or with a chatbot?
But the thing is, we can.
Absolutely.
Those capabilities are there.
But if I went into something saying, here's a chatbot, now where's your problem?
Yeah.
Or here's AI, where's your problem?
Yeah.
I wouldn't find those problems.
Yeah. But I think that's something, what you've just described there is something that is a real great strength of yours, because while we focus on and we encourage the business to focus on their problem, you have to have that breadth of knowledge of tools and capabilities, and not just, a chatbot, but in itself, that in itself means nothing. And actually, the experience of a lot of people with chatbots traditionally is poor.
Yes.
But your view of it is completely different, because you're more aware of what the capability is today and how
Yes.
that could be deployed today to meet that business need. So that's something that is often missing in these conversations as well, that we tend to only see the problem through this lens and we only see the solution through this lens.
Yes.
It's being able to have that broader perspective of the potential for change, or the art of the possible, is really, really important. And you do that very well.
Yeah, thank you. And part of my role is to know where the limits of my knowledge are, but to know where the experts really are, and to bring those into the conversation at the right time.
So you mentioned a digital assistant a couple of times.
Yeah.
Do you want to describe what a digital assistant is?
Yeah, so essentially, I'll talk about some of the ways that I use it. So a lot of the things we do today at our computers are very manual. we're copy and pasting data between applications. What if we could have a digital version of ourselves doing some of that repetitive, mundane, rules-based stuff for us, either on our computer, something we call an attended automation, or better still, on a server or a virtual machine somewhere in a data center or in the cloud, without any human intervention. Now, it depends on the type of process and the type of rules as whether we can do that. But essentially, it means that we can shift some of that workload from being manual, my hands on the keyboard and mouse, to a digital worker doing, essentially emulating the things that I do. I'll give you an example. So I'm going to go back to my personal scenario. So you know from the calls that we have together that I'm a Star Wars fan. And in my normal workplace, when I work from home, the shelves behind me have a huge Star Wars collection. I actually used automation to help me to build that.
Okay.
So when I was building this collection, it was during COVID. And I couldn't get out to shops, and online retailers had very limited stock. So when I had gaps between meetings, I had a list of figures that I wanted, and I would go onto these different 12 online retailers and do a search and see if anything was in stock. And in most cases, things were out of stock. And I thought, why am I doing this manually? I work for an automation company. So I created an automation that would look at my list of figures that I was looking for. It knew how to navigate these 12 websites, and would go looking for figures. And it ran 3 times a day. It ran at 6 a.m., 12 p.m. and 6 p.m. I built my and when it found something in stock, it would send me an email saying, this figure's in stock at this price with this retailer, and here's a link to buy it. I built my collection far too fast for my wife's liking because I was using automation to essentially do what I was doing manually.
But you use the phrase a digital assistant. That's a perfect example of an assistant. It's not just, you're not automating anything as such. You're essentially hiring an assistant to work in a digital way to solve this problem for you and take all this workload off you.
Yeah.
It's a great example. It's a great example. And what's the risk then that, the obvious question, we get asked this question, that your digital assistant goes rogue and buys all these figures that you didn't anticipate at prices you hadn't expected. I mean, how do you manage that sort of risk?
So the key, and this comes down to how we engage with our customers. So the first thing we do is we understand, how do you do the process today? And we'll document that. And the customer will sign it off and say, yes, that's a representation of how I do my process today, including different exceptions. Then we'll create a document that will describe how the automation is going to, how the digital worker, the digital assistant, is going to do that task. Again, it's going to be based on rules and guidance that customers provided, and they sign off against it. And then one of our developers, or one of the customer's developers, will then create that automation from that documentation. So the way I describe it is, imagine you've got the most efficient worker you've ever had that has no initiative. It will only ever do what you tell it to do.
Right, yeah.
That's essentially a digital worker. It's not going to go rogue. It's not going to go Skynet and Terminator and take over the world.
It'll do exactly what you tell it to do.
Yes. Yeah. In the same way that if you train somebody and they're a good worker, they should do it in a consistent and reliable way. Bringing in their knowledge and their understanding, that's fine, but they will do it in a consistent and reliable way. And then essentially we're taking that and giving it to a digital
And once
worker.
you have the business rules and you understand the steps, you've heard me say to customers, they're describing a process and it's a little bit vague, and I say, well, okay, I know nothing about your team. Could you train me how to do it? Yes. They go, yeah, I could train you how to do it. And they, okay, then you could train a digital assistant. Because what you're actually saying is, you can impart the rules and the process to me in a way that it would allow me to do the job. So from what you said, we would just train a digital assistant to do exactly that.
Yes. Yeah. So Francis, thanks for this. Every time I spend time with you, I learn something. And today's no exception. I know we've had many of these conversations one-to-one in the past, but I really did learn a lot from this session, so thank you.
And Dean, honestly, I would say exactly the same thing, and I think it's probably why we work so well together. Going back to our times when we worked in UiPath, you've heard me call you the guru. Because that's the way I think about the knowledge you bring to the table, and I think it's always great to work with you, and this has been really great. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.